Hello, everyone. Since today's guest has done a lot of business in China, I thought it would be appropriate to present a sign near the Great Wall, which attempts to make people aware of the interconnectedness of all things, all beings, but not quite in the way that Westerners would express it. So the sign said in Chinese, it was very short, but in English, it was much longer. And it said literally, people, flowers, and help each other in breath. If you pluck the flowers and break off the branches, you will reduce your own life at the same time. Wonderful thought with that. So today's guest is Australia-based Cynthia Dearin. She's an international business strategist and lawyer and the founder of Dearin and Associates. With 25 years of international experience, she's on a mission to empower business owners and CEOs, mainly in manufacturing, to scale internationally and to amplify their impact in the world. While opportunities abound, many executives have no idea how to start. Cynthia advises clients how to go global and how to reach their full potential. She has lived and worked in the UK, France, the US, Australia, Egypt, the UAE, Iraq, Jordan, Qatar, and Indonesia, and has expanded her clients into the US, the UK, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, China, Hong Kong, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and New Zealand, among others. And she also speaks 3 languages, Australian English, of course, Arabic and French. So welcome, Cynthia. Delighted that you're with us.
Thanks for having me on the show, Philip.
And perhaps you could explain to all of our wonderful, well, our audio listeners can't see it, but our viewers can see your wonderful picture on the wall. You said that was made by your uncle Cedric, was it?
The picture is, the guy in the picture is, his name is Cedric. My uncle is called Neil, but my uncle Neil painted Cedric for me when I was a little girl of about 4. And he's gone all around the world with me for many years, and he's now ended up back in my office in Sydney. So if you look at photographs of my life from around the world, you often see him in the background, which is kind of a little bit funny.
That's wonderful. Yes. Well, he's wonderful to travel with you. It's great to have a world traveler accompany you as well. So I know you've written a book called Business Beyond Borders, Taking Your Company Global.
Yes.
And in it, you mention some of the steps to launch globally.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could give us 3 or 4 steps that one should really start with.
Absolutely. And that, in case you're curious, is what it looks like. That is the book.
Excellent.
So look, I mean, I think there are many steps in the process of going global. And the book has 16 relatively short chapters. And even at that point, the book is a fairly high level overview of how you need to take your company global. For me, the real starting point is figuring out why you are on the global journey and what it is you are trying to achieve. So what happens quite often is that people accidentally start selling internationally because they get some random orders coming through their website, or somebody kind of phones them and says, oh, I saw your thing somewhere on the internet, and could you please send me some to whichever country it happens to be. And people kind of take that as a sign, and they kind of head off down that path, and everything that they do is just reactive to what the universe is throwing at them. That is not really a methodology that I'm particularly fond of. So for me, it's really important to get clear on why are you doing it, and what is it that you're trying to achieve? Because it could be that you react to random orders from overseas, and it takes up a lot of time and energy and effort, and it really doesn't generate you the return on investment that you would get from selling more of the same thing at home. So I think if you're going to do this process, you need to be intentional about it. Then it's really important to pick a market. And again, I encounter a lot of people come to me all the time and I say, where are you thinking of selling to? And they'll say, oh, well, and then they'll reel off the names of 5 markets. And I ask, have you had international experience? Have you done much overseas before? No, I don't think so, but these are the markets I want to do. And I'm like, stop, you can only succeed at anything in life with a lot of focus. So the thinner you spread yourself and the more places you try to go to, the harder it is going to be. So you want to identify one market that you're going to sell to. Once you've done that, you need to work out who are you going to sell to in that market. So, if you sell to everyone, you sell to no one. And so kind of as you would at home, and look, some people haven't even done it for the home market, but you've got to get very clear on who is the person who you can really, and there'll be several, but you've got to pick out for a start one person who you love working with or selling to, who you can really help and who can afford to pay you. And then once you've done that, you need to work out, well, what is my winning offer? You might, I had a company come to me a while ago and they said, well, we've got some herbal capsules of some kind that will improve your health in all these various ways. And we've also got the same thing in powder. Oh, okay, that's good. And, we have some soap infused with this stuff, and we have some chocolate, and we have some hand cream. And I'm like, oh, stop. That's just complicated. And complicated is fine, but it's slower and harder and dumber. So you need to work out what are the things that sell best already that you have, and that generate the highest margins, and see whether perhaps one of those would be the starting point, because what you're trying to do here is go for simple. Simple scales, complex fails. Everything that you're trying to do should be super, super simple. Now, I know you said 3 or 4 steps. Let me give you a couple more. You need to have a single channel that you're going to send your stuff through. So don't say, well, let's do distributors and e-commerce and partnerships, and we'll try some direct sales as well. Let's pick out one that we think is going to be a good place to test and get that really dialed in. And then in the same kind of vein, one marketing channel. If you haven't built your marketing out from overseas, don't say, let's do Facebook ads and trade shows and TikTok videos and let's say, all right, well, we're selling, for example, we're selling a consumer product, and where it's a very good looking product with beautiful branding. Maybe we'll run an Instagram campaign to start with, but we're just going to try one thing. And then lastly, a financial game plan. So figuring out, well, how much, given what we've done in terms of working out what we're going to do, how much money is that going to take? Do we have that money? What will we need to pay for it? If we don't have the money, how will we get it? How will we make that a reality? And I think those are, at a high level, those are the key steps that I like my clients to take.
That's fascinating. Yes. One of the major steps that people overlook when going international is that very often products or services must be reconfigured for the target country. Can you give us an example for our listeners and our viewers of a client you've worked with who has reconfigured a product, either, and sometimes it's in packaging, it's in the shape, it's in the pricing, the colors, the redesign, something like that?
There is a company here in Australia that makes breakfast cereal, very high-end breakfast cereal. It's kind of like high-end granola stuff. And they are not, they're not a mass market product, but they're a well-known niche product here in Australia. And their packaging is very, very simple, because in Australia, we like things that are quite simple and clean. So it was white with black writing. And they wanted to sell that product into China. So they got it up and running, and they sent it off in its original packaging. Now, for people who are listening to this show who do not know, whereas white in Western culture symbolizes purity and cleanliness and innocence and all that kind of stuff, in China, white symbolizes death. So you can imagine that you send off, white packaging with black writing, and it's sort of like death cereal. So that didn't really work super well. And I think from memory, I think what they did was they flipped it around and they made it black with a tiny bit of white writing instead.
They didn't make it red, the packaging.
No, they didn't make it red. No, they didn't make it red with gold writing, but they have to significantly modify the plan that they'd started out with. I mean, similarly, and I'm struggling to think of an exact example in, like off the top of my head, but if you sell to the Middle East, in Australia, again, we like very simple packaging. Mm-hmm. So for us, simple is fashionable.
I'm sorry, what is fashionable? Say it again.
Simple. So, simplicity is very fashionable, minimalism. The Middle East comes from a totally different place. And sort of simple and streamlined is not necessarily premium in the Middle East. So if people are thinking about premium, they're thinking about something that's ornate and gold. So if you want to sell a premium product and you want to put gold all over it in the Middle East, and, you know, maybe some foil, that's going to be fantastic. If you put foil on things here in Australia, people just think it looks gaudy. So, you know, you've got to really take into account what are people's design sensibilities, because they are quite different place to place.
Yeah, those are some wonderful examples. Thank you. Those are great. You mentioned about the Arab world, and I know
Yes.
you've worked a lot in the Arab world. Have you encountered any barriers as a woman or as a younger person?
Look, it's really interesting. I mean, I think both gender and age are both very traditionally important indicators in the Middle East. And so, well, let me put it this way. I did not really encounter barriers as a woman or as a younger person. And to be quite frank, over the years that I have, you know, been a professional, I encountered more obstacles working in Australia than I did out in the Middle East, which people will find quite horrifying. I want to say that alongside that, you have to remember that status is very, very important in the Middle East. And in all the roles that I was doing, I always had a status position. So I first worked in the Middle East as an Australian diplomat, right? And so you get taken out of that normal category and you're kind of, you know, you're in your own category. So the normal rules don't apply. An Australian diplomat who is female can go to, for example, in the Gulf, men's and women's gatherings of local people are separate. Men and women don't socialize together. So if you go to a wedding, the women have their own wedding and then the men have a separate wedding, and the bride and the groom only appear at the women's wedding. The bride does not go really across into the men's wedding. But as an Australian female diplomat, you can move back and forth between the two. So I could go to a men's coffee celebration and be the only woman there. And it was a little weird for me, but it was allowed. And then I could also go across and sit with the women. So it had a kind of a special status. When I was working in Iraq as a management consultant, again, I was there as a management consultant. I was there as a representative of the British government and then of the US government. So again, the normal rules didn't apply. You know, the status of the thing that I was doing trumped the fact that I was, you know, in my 30s and I was female. And then again, I ran an industry association, the Australia Arab Chamber of Commerce and Industry, for a number of years after I came back to Australia. And again, I would travel very frequently out to the region. But again, it's a status position. And so you kind of get a pass. Do you know what I mean? So I don't want to say that no women working in the Middle East have ever had problems and it's a giant myth. That would not be the case. But I want to say it's not as simple as, okay, well, you know, if you're female, then it's all going to be terrible. And if you're young, it's all going to be terrible. It kind of depends. You know, if I was female and Filipina and I was working in a nail salon somewhere in the Middle East, it would be a totally different equation to being a diplomat or a management consultant. So it's also about what you're doing and how people perceive your role in society as to how you get treated.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So do you feel that you are treated equally as a man would be in your role?
I would say I was always treated very, very respectfully. So if people didn't agree with me, because in Middle Eastern culture, you never tell people to their face, no, you're wrong, I don't agree with you. And so people were on the whole, people were very, very respectful. Now, I didn't feel from Arab men, because you would always be saying, well, is there a problem between the men and a woman? No, I found them very polite and very easy to work with. And I created some great friendships and some great professional working relationships over the time that I was there, many of which I still have.
That's fascinating. Wonderful. Can you tell us some of the similarities and differences among Arab countries? The unifying factor, of course, is Islam, but it's practiced differently in different parts of the Arab world, and the way people dress, whether they're more restricted with the hijab, for example, or whether it's open. So not so much those issues, but more fundamental issues about how one does business or how one conducts oneself in these countries.
I think in that way, it's really about greater and lesser degrees of formality, do you know? And again, it's hard to make really blanket statements about it because it depends who you deal with. So, you know, for instance, if you go to the Gulf states and you work there, it is more formal in many ways than and just the way that business happens, you know, sitting in a traditional majlis perhaps is something that you would see more than perhaps if you went up to Lebanon. But it's about it's sort of, I mean, if you think about it in the context of the US and Canada, it's, you know, if you said, well, how is the way that people do business different? The differences kind of country to country are not always glaring. You know, they're subtle. You know, it's about degrees of, I mean, I always think one thing for me that jumps out always is Egyptians are very, very funny people. And things in Egypt are often quite hilarious and funny. It doesn't mean they're always going to be funny when they do business, but they're people who've got a very particular sense of humor that you won't see. So if you go down to the UAE and you go to meetings in Abu Dhabi or Dubai, you might not get the same degree of levity as if you went to some meetings in Cairo, but then it also depends who you are dealing with. You know, if you deal with a country like Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Lebanon, you're going to be dealing with primarily Lebanese or Egyptians or Saudis. Whereas if you go over to some of the other countries where, you know, and the UAE is the key example here, probably also Qatar, the level of immigration is so high. You know, these countries have the highest level of immigration in the world, that the local population is conservatively at somewhere between 10 and 20%. I'd probably say closer to 10 than 20. So local people are in a minority. And when you do business, you know, if you're doing business in Dubai, you might not be meeting with Emiratis. You could very well be meeting with Indians or Pakistanis or Brits or Australians or Europeans. And so,
and when you say locals, you mean nationals?
People, I mean nationals. Yeah, people who are actually from there. Yeah. So I think it's a matter of degree. It's about more and less formality. It's about how punctual people are, you know, time. It's about how directly people communicate with each other. Although I have to say, in general, the Middle East is not famed for direct communication. You know, they prefer indirect communication. There's a lot of reading between the lines. There's a lot of learning to give and accept hints. It's a lot about never directly saying no. It's about not making people lose face, you know, which is also a common theme that you see across many Asian cultures. Hierarchy and status are important. It's important to demonstrate respect to people who are older. I don't know. Does that answer the question?
Yes. No, that's excellent. Perhaps you could you give us an example for our listeners and viewers about time? Time is a very, it's certainly not a Western concept at all, but punctuality in the West is very important, whereas in other countries it's much less important. I used to live in Africa, and one would call it Africa time. You know, think about African time, and you know, don't expect someone to pitch up or show up at a specific time for a meeting.
Yeah.
So, could you give us some examples of how that would work?
Oh yeah, I mean, look, when I worked in Iraq, I was working, well, for the example I'm thinking of, I was working with Americans who, as you know, are towards the punctual end of the spectrum, you know, and these are professional people. And we would go to see, they were counterparts. So there would be Iraqi counterparts from government departments, and they might be advisors to ministers in the government. And we would go off to one of Saddam Hussein's old palaces, which had been obviously after the invasion taken over by Americans. And that was where the meeting would happen. And we would get out of our car and go through all the security and go in and sit down. You know, we'd be there a minute or two early for our 10 o'clock meeting. And we would wait. And we would wait. And it was often very hot. Air conditioning was not really working. And we were all sweating in our suits because, you know, we're still dressed like Western management consultants, even though we're out in the burning hot desert. And I'd already been working in the Middle East for several years at that point. So I'd sit there and be like, oh, this is kind of boring. But this is just normal. And you have to remember, we didn't have smartphones back then either. Everybody was going around with their old Nokia. So unless you had thought to bring a book, there wasn't much to do except to chat to the people around you. And the American guys that I worked with, they'd just be getting so frustrated and, tense and a little bit angry because they felt that they were really being disrespected. Right. And so when you sit down to begin a meeting and half of the people in the meeting are already feeling a little bit irritated, it's not really the best start.
Right, exactly.
And there's just a different time is viewed as more elastic in the Arab world on the whole. And again, I don't want to generalize too much here because it depends who you deal with. If you go to the Gulf and you deal with people who have grown up since the age of 12 in British boarding schools and universities, which a fair number of them have, they have about the same sense of time as we do, and they know what our expectations about time are, and they will be there punctually. But if you go somewhere more traditional, favorite example being Qatar. I was once kept waiting for 2 hours for a meeting in Qatar with a very senior guy at the Chamber of Commerce. And I turned up and his assistant said, I'm so sorry, he's been called into a meeting by the Sheikh. Do you want to have a seat? And I was like, okay. And I sat there and I sat there and I sat there. And after, going on for 2 hours, I felt quite annoyed too, even though I know that I kind of shouldn't because, I'm Australian. And so we tend to be pretty punctual as well, and I don't like to be late myself. I don't like to be kept waiting. And I just had to say, don't get cross, don't get mad. And eventually the guy turned up and we had the meeting and I got the thing that I had gone for, but I had to wait, and thankfully I had learned because I'd been working there for such a long time that that's just how it was. But if I hadn't known that, I would have gotten irritated. And I probably, imagine if that happened and somebody kept you waiting 2 hours in Australia or in the States.
Right. Of course.
Usually you wouldn't, after 20 minutes at a max, you'd be like, well, I'm done. Let's reschedule this. I'm going to keep going. But there you don't. And that's because relationship is more important than getting things done on a certain time schedule. And look, to be frank, that is one of the key things that not just in the Middle East, because you'll see it in Africa and you'll see it in other parts of Asia in more traditional societies where relationships are given preeminence. It can be difficult for Western companies to do business there because the expectations about time are misaligned. The Westerners feel like, oh my goodness, these people are so slow and they're wasting our time and maybe they're just not serious and they don't want to do this. And the people from the traditional culture are thinking, wow, these Westerners are so rude and so abrupt and all they care about is money. And they really don't care about us as people at all. And actually, maybe not sure if we really want to do business with them. So
that's fascinating. Yes. Let's move on to other topics because that is fascinating about time. When companies enter various countries that you've dealt with, how do they measure success? Is it ROI? Is it market share? Is it profitability? Or is it other factors?
Well, look, I think you've got to work out what you're measuring for. So it could be any of those things. For me, let's say, for example, you're a purpose-driven business. You would naturally be measuring how many people's lives you transformed in whatever way your product or service is supposed to operate. But for me, it's at the same time, it's not a charity. So I would always be looking for revenue and I would be looking for profitability. And I think profitability is a very important marker because, as I said at the start, you put a lot of time, energy, and effort into getting an international business up and running. If you can sell at 25% profitability overseas and you can only sell at 25% profitability in your domestic market and you can only sell at 5% profitability overseas, it really does raise the question of, well, is this the right place for us to be? And if it is, what is it about our strategy here that needs adjusting so that we can get to a level of profitability that's at least commensurate to what we've got at home?
Exactly. And similarly, when companies have established themselves abroad, what criteria do you think they should use for deciding whether to expand?
So you're saying when they're actually set up somewhere, then should they take it further?
Yes.
Well, I think you have to look at what the opportunity in the market is, and would you prefer to I guess, would you prefer to consolidate and stabilize the business and get it running to the same standard as your domestic business runs and just expand within that market? Or do you want to open another loop and go for wider coverage? And it's a question of priorities. And I think people often get distracted by shiny objects. So let me give you an example. I did a vision and strategy day for a favorite client this week, and they're selling to Australia, a little bit to New Zealand, and they've opened the Japanese market. And they started off by saying, we have way too many things on our plate and we need to, focus down. And this was what the point of the day was about, getting very focused so they could go faster. And then they said, well, look, we want to add in one more Asian market. I looked at all the things on the whiteboard and I said, look, could I make a suggestion? You've just told me you have too many things on your plate. There are all these areas that need tightening up within the business. Instead of, opening yet another loop and putting in more complexity when you haven't gotten what you have on your plate under control, could we just like stick with the markets that you have for this year? Can we get your production tightened up? Can we get your marketing under control? Because you've told me like that's something that's not working super well. Can we actually just sit down and consolidate what you have and make it work really well before we do anything else?
Okay.
I think less is more personally, but that's me.
That makes perfect sense. You mentioned in your book about Starbucks entering Australia, and basically it failed there. Could you give us some reasons you think why it failed and what others can learn from that experience?
I think it's a classic big company mistake, and it all starts with hubris. People think, well, we know how to do this. And I mean, Starbucks sort of thought, we know how to do this. We've done this all over the world. And they had. And I think essentially they didn't make any effort to really figure out what Australian coffee culture was like. They looked at Australia and they thought, well, it's kind of the same. Former British colony, everybody speaks English, they drink coffee. I mean, like, what wouldn't work out? What they didn't really realize is Australian cafe and coffee culture was formed as recently as post-Second World War. And the key influence was Italian and Greek migration, and people bringing the Greek and Italian culture to major centres in Australia, primarily Sydney and Melbourne to start with, and actually brought the culture of not just drinking coffee as a drink, but it was everything that went with that. I mean, that's still very strong here in Australia today. You go, nobody wants to go to a chain and have an impersonal experience, which is predictable and is going to be just the same wherever you go. What people value is that you can, I did it this morning. I walked up to my local coffee shop and I bought a coffee from somebody I knew, and we had a bit of a chat and, talked about the day. And there are other people from the neighborhood in the coffee shop having breakfast and getting their coffee. That's more along the lines of what people expect on the whole. Starbucks came in without knowing that, and they thought, well, everybody will want this thing that's been so successful everywhere else, and people just didn't. And also people didn't like the taste of the coffee because it's very different to what, we're used to Italian espresso, and that's what we want to drink. And obviously Starbucks coffee is US style coffee, and it just didn't fly. I mean, they had a similar problem in Israel. And I think it's about not understanding the market. I mean, if you, and I don't want to dump on Starbucks at all, because lots of companies have made this mistake. I mean, Bunnings is a very large Australian hardware chain owned by one of the major supermarket groups.
I'm sorry, can you spell it, please?
Yes, I could. Bunnings, Bunnings.
Bunnings, okay.
They decided they would take over a chain store that was not doing so well in the UK. And the chain store was more about home stuff than hardware. And Bunnings is very much about hardware. And again, what happened was they went in, they paid a very significant sum of money to buy this chain of stores all around the UK, and they put Bunnings into it. And it was between 2 and 3 years, the whole thing failed. And they sold it for £1, and they destroyed billions of dollars of shareholder value in the process.
Wow.
And it was really, they took the concept and they thought this concept is going to work. Britain, Australia, we know each other, strong historic ties. What really did work well was Bunnings is famous for having sausage sizzles every weekend.
I'm sorry,
sausage
having what, please?
A thing called a sausage sizzle. So
Sausage
it's where
sizzle.
sizzle. Yeah, it's they do a kind of a barbecue. Charity groups can use the space at Bunnings, and the charity groups get to provide sausages and bread and tomato sauce. And it's like this weekend tradition. So everybody who's going to get the hardware, my kids love it. They always want to go to Bunnings at the weekend for the sausage sizzle. That worked in the UK, but nothing else did. You know, Australia is like, it's kind of like California in a way, you know, lots of big homes on single stories with big gardens where people need lawnmowers and they want to do painting, and the weather's nice for a lot of the year. And that was how the Bunnings, well, that's how Bunnings here works, and that's how it was set up in the UK. I feel like they forgot along the way that, you know, if you go to London or Birmingham or Manchester, people are living in small houses with, you know, 10 square centimeters of lawn, and it's raining for 9 months of the year. Nobody's like doing a barbecue outside. Nobody needs a log splitter, and nobody wants like 200 colors of paint because it's freezing cold and they don't want to spend Saturday on a ladder in the rain, you know, trying to put paint on the roof. So I think, I mean, that could be simplistic. There may be other business reasons in there, but I think it's a lot about the product market fit, and really just have you taken the time to work out whether the thing that you are selling really addresses something that that country that you're going to wants and needs.
Yeah. So rule number 3, I guess, is do your in-country market research first.
Oh, yeah,
Sure
absolutely.
that the market strategy will work, because, as you say, often it doesn't transfer.
And look, it's research, and it's also testing. You know, rather
yes.
than, I think Bunnings would have done better if it had tested a concept and maybe done a flagship store or two somewhere, you know, just in that belt outside London, rather than going in and just buying up a chain of stores and then having it fail.
Right.
So, I mean, I think if you treat your international expansion as a series of small, you know, modestly expensive experiments, that's a far less, it's slower, of course, but it's far less risky than, you know, staking the farm on something and then having it blow up in your face.
Exactly. Yes. I guess one final question would be about China.
Yeah.
You know, Australia has had a lot of diplomatic problems with China, as has the US and the Western world. And increasingly, China is becoming, you know, well, it's always been a dictatorship since 1949, but an autocratic dictatorship where effectively the rule of law doesn't apply. What it does apply is what President Xi decides today after he sneezes or something. So some of our guests have talked about the intrusiveness of the Communist Party and into private sector businesses, and they will tell you whom to hire or whom not to hire, or whether this potential hire is acceptable or not acceptable. How do you advise your clients who now want to go into China?
Well, look, I mean, I think it depends how you are going to do it. And look, I would say on this, there are a range of views. So I think, you know, broadly speaking, politically, I agree with what you say. And I think there is a real level of concern both in the States and also here in Australia about how that is going to play out over the next, say, 7 to 10 years. But then there is a whole other kind of layer of stuff going on below that, which is the commercial sphere and the experience again. And this is why I hesitate to generalize. There are still plenty of companies doing business and making money. I mean, just because the political relationship has gotten rocky, and because some sectors, you know, for us, it's been beef and barley and wine and fresh seafood. Those sectors have been badly affected. But then there are other businesses that, you know, I mean, I know of one that sells kombucha that went into China even over the last 2 years, and it just went boom. You know, it just exploded because it had a popular product that people wanted. So, I mean, how do you deal with that? I was speaking to somebody yesterday who spent 30 years in China, and he was saying to me, look, this idea of government interference is, he just said, I've never seen it personally. I mean, shouldn't go. I mean, he kind of said, look, it's kind of a myth. Of course, there is a hiring regime. Like there is a set of immigration and labor hire processes that you've got to go through in China, but you have to do those anywhere. So, you know, if I want to bring a foreign employee to Australia and sponsor them, it's quite a process. You know, you have to jump through a bunch of hoops. We've got a very strict immigration regime.
No, I'm sorry. I was speaking about Chinese. A foreign
Chinese
company
people
wanting to hire Chinese people, and the government would say, this person perhaps protested either in Hong Kong or in mainland China, whatever, protested, and therefore, the person is unacceptable. Please don't hire her.
Yeah. Well, look, I think you could do it a few ways. You could go through employer of record. So you go to a company that does employer of record hiring, and you work with them so you don't have any employees. You basically you manage that person and you manage their work, but a Chinese entity takes over the back end of that for you and manages all the payroll and stuff. Or you work through distributors, and you kind of, I guess, you remove yourself and the potential for conflict based on being a foreign country as much as you can by feeding it back through the Chinese network. I mean, I would say for people working in China, it's going to be much, much easier. I mean, and this applies to lots of places. Don't want to say it's just China, but, in China, great to work with local people wherever you can. Because those people have got the networks and the influence. And as China is all about guanxi and connections.
Right.
You want to lean on those and use those to help you solve the problems that you've got.
Yes. Well, that makes perfect sense. Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
Look, I would like to say, I think, even despite what we've seen in the trade space over the last few years, I still think there are enormous opportunities for international trade. And I think people shouldn't be scared off by the things that one can read about, geopolitics and about protectionism. I mean, yeah, those are all realities. But at the end of the day, if you have an amazing product that can change lives and make a positive contribution to the planet, people are still going to want to purchase those, and you should still be trying to get your stuff out there and, make your life better, make your community's life better, and make the lives of the people who you are serving and working with better as well. So one, there is still a lot of opportunity. And two, make sure you do research. Don't go in reactively. Actually think about what you're going to do and pick a small target and do that. And thirdly, be patient. It's probably not going to be an overnight success. Overnight success stories often take 10 to 15 years to become a reality. And international expansion is no exception. It's a minimum 3-year journey. If you get lucky, it's a minimum 3-year journey. So if you're going to do it, you have to say, this is going to take a while. I'm okay with that. I'm going to just invest modestly. I'm going to be very patient and disciplined and focused, and we're going to move forward on it a little at a time.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much, Cynthia. That's really extraordinary advice and wonderful insights, and greatly appreciate your being with us today.
It is my pleasure, Philip.
And this has been Philip Auerbach of Auerbach International. And I hope you join us again next week for another episode of Global Gurus and their stories of international business. Thank you.